What would you do if the HOA woke up one morning and fenced off your lake like they owned it? What would you do if you woke up one morning and the HOA had walled off the lake you've cared for your whole life, claiming it as theirs? I knew something didn't add up, until I found the old maps, a forgotten gate, and the one key that could flip everything on its head. And that's when the real fight began. The morning it happened was the kind of morning that usually settled my nerves instead of shattering them. The air over Silverbrush Lake was cool and still, carrying that faint mineral scent that rises off mountain water at first light. My boots pressed lightly into the damp earth as I stepped out from the porch of my ranch house, coffee mug warming my hands, ready for the same peaceful walk to the shoreline I'd taken for more than 20 years. Only this time the view was wrong, too sharp, too metallic, too hostile. Where I should have seen a ribbon of shimmering blue water stretching toward the pine-heavy ridge, I saw steel, an 8-foot chain-link fence, the kind you'd expect around a scrapyard or a military holding yard, not a lake that had once been open and free. The barbed wire on top caught the sun and flashed like teeth. A red sign hung in the center of the nearest panel, crooked as if hammered in by someone impatient. Private HOA property, no trespassing. For a moment I just stood there, coffee held halfway to my lips, unable to make sense of it. A fence didn't just appear. Someone had brought trucks, posts, cement, rolls of steel, and the gall to put it all on ground that didn't belong to them. I felt the first ripple of anger break across my calm, the kind that starts low in the chest before it reaches the voice. I walked closer, boots brushing dried grass, the wind lifting off the lake and pushing warm air through the fence slats. The surface of the water beyond it sparkled like nothing had changed, like it wasn't suddenly trapped behind a barrier no one had asked for. As I approached, movement flickered to my left, and out stepped a figure in a bright pink business suit, looking entirely out of place in the rugged lakeside morning. Bethany Reed, HOA president, self-appointed queen of the cul-de-sac. She stood with her hands clasped behind her back, chin lifted, lips pursed into a smile that carried neither warmth nor welcome. Her SUV, white, spotless, and parked diagonally like it owned the dirt beneath it, glinted behind her. She stepped forward as if greeting a guest at her garden party, rather than the owner of the land she'd just carved in half. "Morning, Remy," she said sweetly, though everything about her tone was sharpened. "Quite an improvement, don't you think?" I glanced from her to the fence, then back again. "Why?" I asked slowly. "Is there a fence on land that isn't yours?" Bethany's smile widened, the kind people wear when they think they've rehearsed the winning line. "Because," she said, gesturing delicately toward the sign, "it is now." A hot sting lit the back of my neck. I'd known Bethany liked rules more than people, and power more than community, but fencing off a lake she didn't own, well, that was new territory, even for her. I stepped closer to the metal, laying my hand on the cold chain links. "Bethany, the property line is 30 feet behind you. This fence is on my land. My deed." "Oh, the old deeds," she cut in, waving a manicured hand like she was swatting a mosquito. "They've been superseded by new HOA shoreline designations. You'll receive the documentation shortly." Shoreline designations. The words stung more than the wind whipping around us. "That's not how property law works," I said evenly. Years designing dams and water rights systems had given me more knowledge of lake boundaries than Bethany could gather in 10 lifetimes of reading HOA handbooks. But she was already turning away. The board voted. It's final. For the good of the community. She emphasized the last word like she owned it, like I wasn't part of it. I looked back at the fence. The metal glinted hard under the rising sun, casting long diagonal shadows across soil that had known my boots since the day I bought this ranch. Water lapped faintly beyond it, a sound that usually soothed me but now grated like something stolen. For a long moment, I didn't speak. I just stared past the barrier at the lake that had shaped my entire life. The lake I'd mapped, dredged, measured, reinforced, protected. The lake that had fed my cattle during drought years and reflected the sky my wife used to sit and sketch on quiet evenings. The lake that wasn't just water, but memory. Bethany watched me, waiting for an argument. I didn't give her one. Not yet. Instead, I asked the question sitting heavy in the air. Why would the HOA fence off a lake they don't own? Bethany's expression flickered, just briefly, like she hadn't expected me to ask it so plainly. She recovered quickly, straightening her jacket and smoothing invisible creases. "You'll find out soon enough," she said, turning away with the kind of confidence that belonged to someone standing on a mistake too big to recognize. She walked off toward her SUV, heels clicking against gravel, as if the earth itself were applauding her. The fence stood silent, unmoving, threatening. The wind carried the metallic scent of steel through the grass. And beneath that, somewhere behind her confidence, was a truth I could feel in my bones. This wasn't about the community. It wasn't even about the lake. Something bigger was coming. And Bethany had just fired the first shot. For the rest of that morning, I tried to busy my hands with chores, mending a loose fence board, checking on the water troughs, clearing out brush near the barn. But every time I stepped toward the lake, even out of habit, that new chain-link wall caught the corner of my eye like a threat waiting to be acknowledged. By noon, I'd lost count of how many times I muttered the same question under my breath. What game is she playing? I didn't get my first clue until later that afternoon, when my neighbor, Jake Mercer, pulled his pickup into my driveway. Jake was a rugged man with a carpenter's hands and the kind of steady temperament you only got from years of working with stubborn timber and unpredictable weather. But today he climbed out of his truck with a tension I wasn't used to seeing on him. "You see it yet?" he asked, jerking his head toward the lake. "Oh, I saw it," I said. "Hard to miss when it cuts straight across my property." Jake let out a humorless breath, the kind that was halfway between a laugh and a groan. "She hit the whole damn shoreline, every house on this side, and she's not stopping there. You hear about the citations?" That got my attention. "What citations?" He walked me over to the flatbed of his truck and grabbed a folded packet of papers. The wind tugged at the corners as he handed it over. The HOA letterhead was sharp and self-important, Bethany's signature at the bottom neat enough to look manufactured. "Unauthorized shoreline activity," I read aloud. "Unapproved boat presence. Failure to comply with new lake preservation regulations." I looked up at Jake. "What new regulations?" "Exactly," he said. "Nobody's ever seen them before today. But she claims they were passed by the board last month. Says they give the HOA full authority over all water-adjacent property, whatever that means." I scanned the citations again, noticing the language, vague, sweeping, and suspiciously convenient. It was the kind of wording that didn't happen by accident. Someone had spent time crafting it. Someone who wanted power to stretch further than it ever had before. "She's after something bigger," Jake muttered. "Some folks think she's struck a deal with a developer. Talk of a luxury marina on the far end of the cove." A marina. That would explain the sudden obsession with control. Developers didn't want residents launching dinghies, fishing from shore, or maintaining private docks. They wanted exclusivity, and they paid well for it. But something still didn't add up. When I'd studied the fence earlier, I noticed it wasn't perfectly straight. It ran the property line like a knife until it reached the far east corner, where it broke slightly off angle, veering awkwardly around a section of land most people assumed was useless scrub. Except it wasn't useless, not to me. A memory stirred, old county maps, early surveys, hand-drawn plats from decades ago, when I was still a dam engineer, and spent half my time reviewing land parcels around the valley. Something about that corner had always stuck with me. A jog in the boundary line, a strange reference to a private lot nobody ever talked about. Jake followed my gaze as I looked toward that bend in the fence. "You see something?" "I see a mistake," I murmured. Bethany was many things, loud, controlling, drunk on her own authority. But she wasn't a surveyor. She didn't understand how land truly fit together, how history lived in the soil and in the paperwork older than any HOA. She saw a fence line. I saw the ghosts of old boundary markers, easements, and deeds that couldn't be erased with a signature. As the afternoon light deepened to amber, I walked the length of the fence, tracing every post with my eyes, counting the steps, watching how the metal angled toward that forgotten patch of land. At the far corner, the grass was taller, the fence line sloppy, rushed. Someone had wanted this section finished quickly, too quickly to notice what they were fencing around. I crouched down, pressing my hand to the dirt. Beneath the dry topsoil, I could feel faint impressions. Old footpaths, once packed by decades of use, now swallowed by neglect. A faint memory surfaced. A narrow access point long abandoned, but never dissolved. "They fenced the lake," I said quietly. "But they didn't fence the law." As if on cue, the metal gate clanged somewhere behind me, and when I turned, Bethany was striding along the shore path in that bright pink suit of hers, clipboard tucked under her arm like a sheriff's badge. She stopped several yards away, close enough to shout, but far enough to keep the fence between us. "Patrolling your new kingdom?" I called out. She raised an eyebrow, the expression smug. "I'm ensuring compliance. You'll find that things run much smoother when everyone respects authority." I stood slowly, brushing dirt from my hands. "This land's been here a long time, Bethany. Longer than you, longer than your HOA bylaws. You sure you understand the history you're trying to rewrite?" Her smile tightened. She didn't answer the question. Instead, she turned and walked away, her heels ticking over the wooden boardwalk like a metronome of arrogance. I watched her until she disappeared behind a curve of shoreline trees. Then I looked again at that crooked corner of fencing, feeling a ripple of certainty move through me. Something was wrong with the way she'd built this wall. Something she hadn't seen. Something she didn't understand. And whatever it was going to be her undoing. That thought stayed with me all the way back up the slope to my workshop. The building sat behind the ranch house, its cedar siding weathered by decades of sunlight and mountain storms. When I stepped inside, the familiar scent of old timber, graphite pencil, metal drafting tools, and rolled blueprints washed over me like a memory I hadn't visited in years. I flicked on the overhead lights. Dust motes drifted lazily in the beams, turning the room golden. The large drafting table at the center carried scars from a lifetime of lake measurements, dam inspections, hydrology sketches, and the occasional cup of spilled coffee during late-night work sessions. But I hadn't touched most of that work since retiring. Now, I needed every scrap of it. I started pulling out the long cardboard tubes stored in the corner, each one labeled in faded black marker. County Survey 1983, Silver Brush Hydrology Study, Rights of Way Revision 1991. One by one, I laid them across the table until the entire workspace looked like the archives of a forgotten engineer's museum. The fence outside still pressed against my thoughts, forcing me to hurry. I uncapped a tube, slid out a sheet, and let the brittle paper unfurl across the table. It flattened with a soft sigh, edges curling up from age. At first I saw nothing unusual, just shoreline curves, elevation notes, discharge readings. But then, on a sheet from the late 80s, my eyes caught a small dotted line near the eastern bend of the lake. A faint annotation, almost erased by time, pedestrian easement, Lot 14A. The number lit my mind like a spark. Lot 14A. That was the forgotten corner. The crooked bend. The place where Bethany's fence zigged instead of following a straight boundary. I leaned over the table, tracing the dotted line with my fingertip. The easement wasn't big. 5 feet wide, maybe. But it cut directly from a private lot to the lakefront, long before the HOA had ever existed. And more importantly, easements recorded on county plats didn't disappear simply because someone wished they would. Someone like Bethany Reed. I pulled open another tube, then another, building a layered map of old rights-of-way, water district surveys, and topographical revisions. And there it was again. Lot 14A, a tiny backlot with a sliver of legal access. Not to the road, not to the HOA trail, to the lake. A quiet thrill moved through me. Not joy exactly, something steadier, something like the first steady beat of strategy after a blow. I'd always believed land carried its own memory. The lake, the soil, the documents, they remembered history even when people forgot or chose to ignore it. I wasn't about to ignore it. On instinct, I reached for my phone and scrolled to the number of someone I trusted with more than just paperwork. Sarah Mitchell, environmental attorney, former colleague, and one of the smartest people I'd ever known when it came to water rights. She picked up on the second ring. "Remy? Been a while," she said, her voice warm and steady. "You finally decide to come out of retirement?" "Not exactly," I replied. "But I might need a favor?" "That sounds like trouble." "It's HOA trouble." She made a sound halfway between a laugh and a groan. "Oh Lord, say no more. What happened?" "They fenced off the lake," I said simply. "My lake, and the neighbors, but mostly mine." "That's bold. Illegal too, depending on the lines." "That's what I need you for." She paused, letting that sink in. "All right, Remy. What have you found so far?" I sent her a picture of the old easement line, zoomed in on the faded dotted path marked Lot 14A. Several seconds passed before she spoke again. "Is that original recording? Pre-HOA?" "Yes. At least 2 decades earlier." She let out a low whistle. "If that easement still exists in the chain of title and hasn't been extinguished by a court order, then it's still valid." "Exactly. And if it's valid," she continued, "then you, or whoever owns that lot, still has legal pedestrian access to the lake regardless of fences built after the fact." "That's what I was thinking," I said quietly, looking again at the crooked corner where the fence twisted around the old lot. "What about the current owner?" she asked. "Do you know who owns Lot 14A now?" "No," I admitted. "Not yet. But I'll find out." The air in the workshop seemed to shift then, as if the maps themselves exhaled with me. Attention eased, not because I had the answer, but because I knew where the answer lived. Somewhere, buried in county records or tucked inside an old deed binder, was the key to undoing everything Bethany had built. "Send me everything you have," Sarah said. "I'll start digging through the legal side. You dig through the historical. We'll meet in the middle." I nodded instinctively, even though she couldn't see it. "Thanks, Sarah." "Don't thank me yet," she said. "HOAs get mean when they think they're losing control." I ended the call and stood over the scattered maps, the paper whispering softly in the draft, coming through the workshop window. Outside, the lake shimmered behind a steel barrier that had no right to be there. But paper was older than steel, and the law was older than Bethany's ambition. I rolled up the maps carefully, setting aside each sheet that mentioned Lot 14A, its easement or shoreline access. It felt like reassembling a treasure map, except the treasure wasn't gold. It was truth. A truth Bethany had overlooked. A truth I was about to use. And somewhere out there was the owner of that forgotten lot, the person who held the missing piece of the puzzle. I intended to find them. The next morning, The sky was a pale blue washed with thin strips of clouds, the kind of sky that promised a quiet day if you knew how to read it. I grabbed a thermos of coffee, tucked the copied plat maps under my arm, and drove down the gravel road that curved around the eastern ridge. The truck rattled over the washboards, dust swirling behind me like a tail. As I approached the bend where the fence kicked sideways, the land dipped toward a patch of older houses, homes built long before the modern development began swallowing the valley. Lot 14A was one of them. The driveway was barely visible from the road, half buried under needles shed by tall pines leaning like tired sentinels. I pulled in slowly, tires crunching over gravel that hadn't been tampered with in years. The house itself was small, wooden, and sun-faded. Its porch sagged at the edges, and a pair of rusty wind chimes clinked faintly in the breeze. It looked forgotten, but not abandoned. Lived in, just quietly. Before knocking, I caught sight of something behind the house. An old shed with peeling paint, and behind that, the corner of a slanted wooden structure, half hidden by thick vines. My pulse kicked. It was exactly where the easement should have been. I stepped onto the porch and knocked twice. After a moment, I heard slow footsteps approach, followed by the soft scrape of a deadbolt. The door opened just enough for a man's face to appear, weathered, lined, eyes a soft gray that had seen far more than mine ever had. "Morning," he said. "Can I help you?" "Morning," I replied. "Mr. Hale? Marcus Hale?" "Yes. And you are?" "My name's Remy Cole. I own the ranch on the main shoreline. I think we might need to talk about something important." He studied me for a long breath, then opened the door wider. "Come in." Inside, the house smelled faintly of cedar and old paper. A wall of framed photos, his late wife, fishing trips, grandchildren, hung crookedly but proudly. He motioned for me to sit at a small kitchen table worn smooth by years of elbows and coffee cups. "So," Marcus said, lowering himself into the chair opposite me, "what brings you all the way to an old man's doorstep?" I spread the maps across the table. "This," I said gently, "and the fence they built yesterday." He leaned forward, eyebrows rising as he recognized the layout of land he'd lived on most of his life. "Haven't seen these old plats in years," he murmured. "That dotted line. Haven't thought about it in even longer." "That dotted line," I echoed, "is a pedestrian easement. It leads from your property directly to the lake." He exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand along his jaw. "My wife and I used that gate back when the neighborhood was nothing but a handful of homes. Most folks came down through our yard to swim or fish. Nobody minded. HOA didn't exist then." "And now that it does," I said, "they've fenced everything off. Everything except your easement, because they didn't know it existed." Marcus gave a dry chuckle. "Bethany Reed knows plenty, but she never knew how to read the land. She and her board showed up here a few months back asking about trimming some trees. Didn't ask about the gate, though. Guess they didn't see it." I hesitated before asking the question that had been building since yesterday. "Does the gate still exist?" He nodded slowly. "Back there behind the shed. Overgrown, but still standing. Haven't opened it in over 20 years. A quiet thrill moved through me. "Marcus, does anyone else know about it?" "Not a soul," he said. "But I suspect you didn't come here just to remind me of an old wooden door." "No," I admitted. "I came because I think that door is now the only legal access point left on this side of the lake, and I think the HOA is counting on everyone forgetting it." He leaned back, weary eyes sharpening with interest. "Well now, that would give you quite an advantage, wouldn't it?" "It would," I said. "But only if the easement is still tied to the property. Only if the deed hasn't changed." Marcus let out a quiet sigh, the kind that carries years of memories. Remy, I've been thinking of leaving. My daughter wants me to move closer to her, and this house, well, it's more than I can keep up with these days. I felt my breath pause. Are you saying that the property's for sale? He finished. Yes, quietly. Don't much care for listing agents poking around and making this place look like a commodity. I couldn't help but smile. Marcus, I'm not here to take advantage of you, but I am interested, very interested. He waved off the concern. You're a good man. I've watched you fix fences for neighbors without asking for a dime. I know what your wife meant to you. I know what that lake means to you. If someone's gonna buy this land, I'd rather it be someone who respects its history. My throat tightened for a moment, unexpected emotion breaking through the strategy. Would you mind showing me the gate? I asked. He stood, moving slower than he once had, but with surprising steadiness. Come on, it's been waiting long enough. We stepped outside, the sun warming our backs as we moved around the side of the house. Pine needles cushioned our steps. The shed's paint curled away from the siding like old parchment. And behind it, barely visible beneath curtains of ivy, stood a wooden gate leaning slightly forward, its hinges orange with rust. Marcus tugged some vines aside. Here she is. The gate creaked in the wind, like it remembered us. I reached out, brushing my fingers along the rough grain. Beneath the layers of time and weather, I felt something solid, something enduring. A forgotten doorway the HOA hadn't even bothered to look for. Does it still lock? I asked. Marcus reached into his shirt pocket, pulled out a tiny ring of keys, and selected one with a flaking brass head. Only one way to find out. He pressed it into my palm. For old time's sake, he said, and maybe for new ones too. I closed my fingers around the key, feeling its weight settle deep into my hand and deeper into my plans. This wasn't just a gate. It was leverage. It was history. And it might just be the beginning of the end for Bethany's brand new wall. The next 48 hours moved like a slow-building storm. You could feel something gathering in the air, pressure rising, clouds thickening, but no lightning yet. Not until the right moment. I drove home from Marcus's place with the key in my pocket, rubbing against my leg with every bump in the dirt road, reminding me of what it represented: access, power, and a loophole strong enough to crack the entire foundation of Bethany's scheme. That evening, I spread the deed copies and survey maps across my kitchen table. My old lamp cast a warm circle of light, leaving the rest of the room in a soft dusk. Outside, the lake shimmered under the moonlight, the fence gleaming like a scar traced across the land. Every few minutes, the wind carried the metal's faint rattle through the open window, as if the fence itself was uneasy about what I had just learned. I snapped a photo of the easement documents and sent them to Sarah. 10 minutes later, she called. You were right, she said without preamble. The easement was registered before the HOA existed. It's legally attached to that parcel. As long as someone owns Lot 14A, the HOA can't obstruct access. And if that someone is me? I asked. There was a small pause on the line. I knew that pause. It meant she was smiling. Then you'd hold the only legal key to the lake from that side of the shore, and the HOA couldn't stop you. I let the words sink in, the room suddenly feeling wider, brighter, as if the walls themselves approved. All right, then I'm buying the lot. When? She asked. As soon as Marcus is ready. We made a plan. Sarah would draft the purchase documents, review the chain of title, and confirm the easement was intact, untouched, unchallenged. Everything would be airtight. Bethany might fight with attitude, but I'd fight with the law. And the law doesn't take sides. It just stands where it stands. The next morning, a thin layer of fog settled along the shore, drifting lazily across the lake like a veil. I drove to Marcus's house early. He was already on the porch, a mug steaming in his hands. He didn't say a word when he saw me walking up the steps. He just nodded, like he'd expected me all along. "You ready?" I asked. He sipped his coffee thoughtfully. "Reckon I am. I talked to my daughter last night. She said it's about time I let this old place go and move closer to the grandkids." There was a bittersweet edge to his tone. This wasn't just property. This was decades of a life lived fully. I respected the weight of that. "I promise I'll take care of it," I told him. He nodded again, slower this time. "I know you will." We signed the preliminary agreement that morning. Sarah finalized the paperwork by evening, and by the next day, under a sky stacked with storm clouds, we met at the county registrar's office. Rain pattered lightly against the windows, streaking down in thin silver lines. The clerk stamped the final document. The heavy thud of the seal hitting paper echoed through the quiet room. Just like that, Lot 14A and its forgotten gate belonged to me. When Marcus handed me the official envelope containing the deed, he placed his hand over mine, steady and warm. My Martha always said that gate was meant for something. Maybe this is it. "I'll make sure it counts," I said. He smiled, then walked out into the drizzle, shoulders lighter than when I'd met him. I drove straight to the property afterward. The rain had stopped, leaving droplets clinging to pine needles like tiny beads of glass. The air smelled of wet bark and clean earth. I walked behind the shed, the ground soft beneath my boots, and approached the old wooden gate, the one that had changed everything. I took out the key. The brass had darkened with age, but the grooves were still sharp. I slid it into the lock. It resisted at first, stiff with years of disuse. I twisted gently, feeling the old metal complain. Then, with a low, gritty pop, the shackle released. The gate creaked inward, the hinges groaning like an old man waking from a long sleep. Beyond the wooden frame lay the narrow strip of land leading directly to the fenced-off lakefront. And there, only a few yards ahead, stood Bethany's proud barrier, her monument to control, completely unaware that I now owned the only door through it. I stepped across the threshold. The ground felt different beneath my feet, like stepping into a new chapter. Each breath I took carried the scent of wet soil and possibility. The lake glimmered through the fence, silver and restless. "This is mine," I whispered. "Not the fence, not the obstruction, but the right to walk this land. The right to push back against someone who believed rules bent only in her direction." I didn't open the chain-link gate yet. That moment needed to be chosen. Not today, not in silence. It needed witnesses. It needed impact. It needed to be the moment Bethany understood exactly who she was dealing with. As I stepped back, relocking the wooden gate behind me, I felt something shift inside. A calm, steady fury rising with purpose rather than heat. The war had begun days ago. But today? Today, I'd taken the high ground. The next morning broke clear and bright, sunlight skimming across the lake like a sheet of polished glass. The storm had washed the valley clean, leaving the air sharp with the scent of pine and damp earth. I drove to Lot 14A with a bed full of tools: hinges, screws, sandpaper, stain, a can of oil thick enough to wake metal that had slept for decades. It felt strange, restoring something that had been forgotten for so long. But that gate wasn't just a relic. It was a weapon, and weapons needed to be sharpened. When I reached the back of the property, dew still clung to the grass. The wooden gate sagged in its frame, vines draped over it like tired arms. I peeled the ivy aside and ran my hand along the wood. It was rough, splintered in places, but still solid. Built in an era when things were made to last, not just look good. I unscrewed the old hinges, each bolt resisting like it remembered the hands that had put it there. The metal groaned under the wrench, flakes of rust falling to the soil. Birds called softly from the pines overhead as I worked, and somewhere across the water, the faint droning of an outboard motor reminded me of how alive the lake used to feel, before Bethany had strangled access with her wall. By noon, the new hinges were fixed, the frame reinforced, and the gate moved with a measured, respectful creak instead of the pained groaning it had started with. I sanded the outer boards until the grain stood warm and visible beneath my palms, then brushed on a fresh coat of stain the color of dark honey. As it dried, sunlight caught the sheen and made the wood glow. The lock, though, that was my favorite part. The old padlock had seized badly from years of disuse. I soaked it in oil, working the key back and forth, until the tumblers clicked smoothly. When the shackle finally popped open with a crisp, metallic snap, satisfaction warmed my chest. That sound, clean, decisive, certain, felt like a promise. The key turned easily now. It was ready. I pocketed it again, feeling its reassuring weight. Around mid-afternoon, I heard tires crunching on gravel. Bethany's white SUV rolled by at a crawl, her window sliding down with the slow menace of a villain in an old Western movie. She leaned out, sunglasses perched high on her nose, lips pursed to a thin, angry line. "Working hard, Remy?" she called out, tone dripping with suspicion. I turned casually, wiping sawdust off my hands. "Just keeping up with property maintenance. You know how it is. Can't let things fall apart." She narrowed her eyes. "You won't get near that lake again. Hope you understand that." A breeze lifted, pushing the scent of fresh stain and oiled metal toward her. I gave her a small, polite smile, a smile that meant nothing to her and everything to me. "Well," I said, "stranger things have happened." Her jaw tightened. She revved the engine and drove off, tires spinning a little too hard for a gravel road. Jake once said Bethany's driving always matched her mood. Fast when she was anxious, erratic when she was losing control. She'd driven away quickly today. Good. She should feel something shifting. By late afternoon, I'd cleared a clean corridor from the back door of the house to the gate, cutting away years of brush, removing dead branches, hauling out stones that made the path uneven. When I finished, sunlight poured down the lane like it was highlighting a secret meant only for those who knew where to look. I stood there quietly, feeling the air settle around me. This wasn't the loud kind of preparation, not the kind with shouting or threats or HOA meetings turned into battlegrounds. This was slow, methodical work, the kind that looks like nothing until suddenly it becomes everything. I walked back onto the lakeside common area through the open gate, just to feel the moment. The grass was warm beneath my boots, the faint hum of cicadas rising from the tall reeds by the shoreline. A dragonfly hovered near the fence, its wings flashing like shards of blue glass. Bethany's precious barrier loomed a few feet ahead, tall and severe, blocking what she believed was her territory. I stood behind it now, inside it, without breaking a single rule. Funny thing about fences, I murmured to myself. They only work when you understand the lines. I gently pushed the wooden gate closed, the hinges whispering instead of screaming. The padlock clicked. Everything was ready. But the reveal needed a stage. I could picture it already, a public moment, something Bethany would create with her own hands, her own pride. She loved events, gatherings, speeches. She adored audiences, and when someone like her thought she had total control, that's when she spoke the loudest. All I had to do was wait for her to give me the perfect opening. As the sun dipped lower, turning the lake's surface bronze, I headed back to my truck. The key tapped lightly against my thigh as I walked, a rhythm steady and sure. like a heartbeat aligning with purpose. This wasn't just preparation. This was the quiet before the storm, the breath before the strike, the moment a man decides not to fight harder, but smarter. And when the moment came, when Bethany gathered every neighbor behind her precious fence to show off her new dominance, I'd step through the one door she never knew existed. It didn't take long. 2 days after I'd finished restoring the gate, bright HOA flyers appeared on every wooden porch rail in the neighborhood, tucked into flower pots, taped to mailboxes, fluttering beneath porch lights like neon-colored warnings of what was coming. Lake Appreciation Day, hosted by HOA President Bethany Reed. Food, music, community announcements, and a speech on shoreline security. I nearly laughed when I read it. Bethany wasn't just confident, she was showing off. This was her coronation, her victory parade. The timing was so perfect I almost wondered if fate had a sense of humor. The morning of the event dawned bright and loud. Families walked toward the fenced-off lake with lawn chairs and coolers. Kids ran ahead with inflatable toys, deflated though, because Bethany had banned any water access for safety reasons. Voices carried over the meadow, mixing with the distant hum of a portable speaker being tested. From my vantage point on Lot 14A, just out of sight, I could hear everything. Make the lake safer. Preserve the value of our community. New regulations for everyone's benefit. Her words floated through the trees like unwelcome guests. I checked the wooden gate one more time, ensuring the hinges swung without a sound. The fresh stain gleamed under the sunlight, warm and rich. The key slid into the lock so easily now it almost felt eager. The chain-link fence on the HOA side loomed ahead, its steel rising like an artificial cliff. People were gathering. The air thickened with conversation, music, the hiss of a grill, and the underlying buzz of frustration from neighbors who had been treated more like trespassers than residents. This moment needed to matter. I stepped back, inhaled the scent of pine, earth, and faint charcoal from the grill, drifting over the fence. I waited until the microphone squealed, a sure sign Bethany was stepping up to speak. Then I placed my hand on the gate latch. "Showtime," I whispered. I pushed the gate open and stepped through. The transition from the quiet of the back lot to the noise of the HOA gathering was immediate, like stepping from a forest clearing into a stadium. The metal lock hanging from the chain link rattled lightly as I approached. With a firm twist of the key, it popped open with a crisp, echoing clack. The sound cut through the crowd like a dropped plate in a silent room. Heads turned. Someone gasped. A child pointed. And there I was, stepping through the chain-link opening onto the manicured grass of the HOA's precious event, sunlight striking the key I still held between my fingers. Bethany froze mid-sentence on her stage, a folding platform draped with blue and white streamers. Her turquoise blazer flashed in the sun as she snapped her head toward me, eyes wide behind her oversized sunglasses. For a heartbeat, the entire lakefront fell silent. Then her voice cracked across the space like a whip. "Remy." "Cole," she shrieked into the microphone, feedback squealing. "How did you get in here?" The heat of 100 curious stares pressed against my back as I continued walking, each step measured, calm, unhurried. I could feel the damp earth beneath my boots, hear the soft rustle of wind through the reeds, smell the warm scent of grilled corn drifting from the HOA barbecue tent. I reached a shady spot beneath a tall cottonwood, leaned my fishing rod against the trunk, and opened my tackle box as if I were settling in for a peaceful afternoon. "Afternoon, Bethany," I said, not raising my voice. "Lovely turnout. Seems like a perfect day to enjoy the lake." "You're trespassing!" she screeched, stabbing a finger toward me. "This is a secure HOA area. Secure!" "Is it?" I asked, tapping the chain-link gate behind me with one hand. The gate swung slightly with the motion, hinges smooth, opening wide like the entrance to a park rather than a fortress. Strange how easy it was to walk right in. Two HOA board members, Gary with the nervous posture and Carol with the ever-present clipboard, hurried toward me, but Bethany stopped them with a sharp wave. "No," she snapped. "I want him to explain himself." I held up the key between my fingers, letting the light catch it. "This," I said simply. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Bethany's face twisted. "A key? A key? That gate is on HOA land." "Actually," I replied calmly, "it's not." Another wave of whispers swept through the audience. I could see heads turning, neighbors exchanging bewildered looks. Bethany stomped one heel into the grass. "Yes, it is! You can't just walk onto community land because you feel like it." I shrugged lightly. Didn't say I was walking onto community land. I walked from my land, through my easement, through my gate. I let that hang in the air. For the first time since I'd known her, Bethany looked unsure. Eyes flickering, calculating, suddenly aware that her script no longer matched the moment. "What easement?" she snapped. "There's no easement." "Funny thing," I said, reaching into my jacket. "You don't get to erase county history with a fence post." I held up a folder. The crowd leaned closer. "According to records from 1979, I continued, this piece of land, Lot 14A, carries a pedestrian easement granting direct access to the lake. That easement never disappeared. The HOA never challenged it. And as of 3 days ago," I tapped my chest lightly, "I own Lot 14A. A collective gasp shivered through the gathering. Bethany's mouth opened and closed like she'd lost all the words she once wielded like weapons. You bought a lot just to bypass the fence?" "No," I said. "I bought the lot because the law gave me a door. You're the one who built a wall without checking what was behind it." Sunlight glinted off the key between my fingers as I slipped it back into my pocket. Behind Bethany, the lake sparkled freely, calm and blue. No fence, no barrier, no HOA decree strong enough to stop what was coming next. And from the way the neighbors were starting to smile, slow, disbelieving, hopeful smiles, I knew this moment was only the beginning. A hush settled across the gathering, thin and tense as fishing line. Bethany stood frozen on her makeshift stage, mic in hand, mouth half open. Her turquoise blazer shimmered under the sun, but all the shine in the world couldn't cover the crack spreading across her confidence. I walked forward, unhurried, the dry grass crunching beneath my boots. The tackle box swung lightly at my side, its metal latch tapping like a heartbeat against its lid. When I reached the open space before the crowd, I lifted my voice. Not loud, just steady. "I'm here today," I said, "because this lake doesn't belong to fear. It doesn't belong to fences, and it sure doesn't belong to one person who thinks rules exist only for other people." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Agreement, surprise, relief. It was hard to tell. Maybe all three. Bethany jabbed the air with the microphone. "Don't listen to him. He broke into a secured HOA event. This is illegal trespass." "Bethany," I interrupted gently, "you really want to finish that sentence?" I pulled a folder from my jacket and held it up. The sunlight washed over the manila cover, revealing the crisp county seal stamped in the corner. The crowd leaned in. Even kids stopped tugging at their parents' hands. The air thickened with anticipation. "This," I said, opening the folder, "is the original deed for Lot 14A. Attached is the recorded easement dated 1979, which grants the owner of that lot, now me, legal pedestrian access to this lakefront." Gasps echoed. Some neighbors looked stunned. Others smiled in open vindication. And here, I continued flipping through the pages, is the county's confirmation that this easement has never been revoked, challenged, or amended. Ever. I closed the folder with a soft thump. So if I'm trespassing, then the county is wrong. And I don't think they are. For a moment, silence ruled the shoreline. Then a familiar voice rose from behind the crowd. He's right. Sarah Mitchell stepped forward, her curly hair catching the breeze, sunglasses pushed atop her head. Dressed in jeans, a light jacket, and a badge holder around her neck, she carried the presence of someone who knew the law not as theory, but as muscle memory. Bethany's face drained of color. Sarah nodded toward me, then turned to the crowd. I've reviewed the documents personally. Remy is well within his rights. The HOA has no authority to block, restrict, or penalize access through a pre-existing private easement. Someone clapped, then another, and another. The applause grew, rolling through the gathering like a wave breaking across the lake. Bethany shot daggers at Sarah. You don't speak for this community. I speak for the law, Sarah said calmly. And the law says you overstepped. A man near the back, Jim from Cedar Loop, called out. So the fence doesn't even apply to him? No, Sarah replied. It doesn't. Carol, the HOA secretary, clutched her clipboard tighter, eyes darting between Bethany and the crowd. Gary adjusted his tie nervously. Sweat gathered at his temples. The board, Bethany's loyal shield, was cracking. I lifted my fishing rod, resting it casually over my shoulder. If we're done arguing, I said, I'd like to enjoy the lake you've all gathered here to appreciate. The crowd parted as I walked past them. Some gave me pats on the back. Others nodded with quiet gratitude. A few just stared, stunned that someone had finally stood up to the wall that had appeared overnight. Bethany sputtered into the mic, "Stop him! Somebody stop! This is outrageous! This is—" But nobody moved. Not a single person lifted a hand. It was the first time I'd ever seen her powerless. I stepped to the water's edge, the soft lap of waves meeting the shore. The lake smelled of sun-warmed reeds and mountain minerals, familiar, comforting, unchanged, despite everything she'd tried to do to it. I cast my line with a smooth, practiced motion. The hook sailed through the air and kissed the surface with barely a splash. Ripples spread outward, gentle and sure. For a few seconds, nothing else existed. Not the fence, not the HOA, not the shouting behind me, just me and the lake. Then I heard footsteps crunch through the grass. Sarah stopped beside me, arms crossed. You know she's not done, she said quietly. Oh, I know, I replied. But today she lost control of the story. Sarah smiled. You always did know exactly when to let the facts speak. The breeze shifted, carrying the faint smells of sunscreen, barbecue smoke, and fresh-cut grass. Behind us, neighbors began whispering, assembling small clusters of conversation. Some pointed at the open chain-link gate. Others shook their heads in disbelief. Bethany stood on the stage alone, gripping her microphone with white knuckles, as if trying to rewrite the scene by force of will. But the moment had already slipped from her grasp. The lake glistened. The fence stood defeated. And the truth echoed louder than her voice ever had. That afternoon became the spark that lit every quiet frustration the community had been swallowing for months. By evening, phones buzzed with group chats full of screenshots, video clips, and long-awaited complaints. Someone posted the exact moment the lock clicked open. Someone else posted the freeze frame of Bethany's stunned expression. Neighbors sent around excerpts from the easement documents I'd shown, each photo clearer than the last. By the next morning, the HOA office email inbox had overflowed. So had my voicemail. But the call that mattered came from Sarah. Remy, she said, voice crisp with purpose. The county clerk called me early this morning. That good or bad? Bad for Bethany, good for us. She arrived at my house half an hour later, dust still clinging to her boots. She carried a thin envelope, white, official, threatening in its simplicity. She handed it to me, tapping her finger on the seal. Open it. Inside were 3 sheets of paper, parcel maps, HOA boundary filings, and a detailed note from the county survey team. The top page included a sentence so dense with legal weight it practically thumped against my chest. HOA President Bethany Reed submitted shoreline boundary amendments containing material inaccuracies and unauthorized claims of jurisdiction. I raised an eyebrow. Material inaccuracies? That's polite. Sarah exhaled sharply through her nose, the closest she ever got to laughing when she was angry. She didn't just overstep, she misrepresented boundary lines, claimed portions of private land as HOA-controlled common area. That's a violation, a severe one. And the county cared? Oh, they cared, Sarah said. They already notified the sheriff's office in case anything escalates, and the board is required to convene an emergency meeting. I leaned back against the porch rail, absorbing the information. The sun glinted off the lake, spreading lines of gold across the ripples. Somewhere down by the fence, a few neighbors gathered in small groups, pointing, discussing. People who had been quiet too long had finally found their reason to speak. So now what? I asked. Sarah didn't hesitate. Now we let her crumble under her own paperwork. Late that afternoon, the HOA board gathered inside the community clubhouse, one of those sterile, echoing rooms meant for birthday parties and bake sales, not the unraveling of fragile authority. I walked in quietly, taking a seat near the back. Sarah slid into the chair beside me. The room buzzed with tension, every whisper feeling like it might set the whole place alight. Bethany entered last. Her blazer was still a bright shade of turquoise, but the sharp lines of her posture were wilted. She clutched her clipboard like a life raft, though now it only seemed to drag her down. Gary and Carol flanked her, but neither looked eager to stand too close. The meeting opened stiffly. Then the county notice was read, aloud. A wave passed through the room, a ripple of gasps, soft curses, quiet indignation. Bethany tried to speak quickly, but her voice shook. This is being blown out of proportion. I was simply enforcing new regulations for the safety of... A voice interrupted her. Old Mrs. Brighton, who never raised her tone above a gentle tremor, spoke with a strength that startled even herself. Safety. You fenced off our lake. You fined Jim's grandkids for fishing. You've made this place miserable. Heads nodded all across the room. Bethany blinked, stunned that resistance had sprouted everywhere she turned. Another resident stood, Hector from the North Ridge. You said the board approved these new rules, but none of us remember voting on them. Gary swallowed loudly. We didn't exactly vote. Carol stared at the floor. Bethany snapped her head toward them. You're supposed to support me. We supported the HOA, Gary said softly. Not this. More murmurs. The dam of frustration was cracking. Then someone else stood. A woman I didn't know well, from Maple Loop. Remy was right. You used fear to control people, but what you did was illegal. I could feel the shift in the air. The room wasn't hers anymore. I didn't stand. I didn't need to. Sarah rose instead. Calmly, professionally, she recited the legal implications of boundary fraud, misrepresentation, and filing inaccuracies. The HOA had overstepped on paper before they overstepped on land. The county would investigate. There could be fines. There could even be forced correction of every structure or boundary built under the false filings. Bethany trembled as Sarah spoke, tiny shakes in her hands, in her jawline, in the clipboard pressed to her chest. The collapse had begun. Slowly, painfully, publicly. When Sarah finished, the board conferred briefly. Very briefly. Gary cleared his throat. Effective immediately, we are suspending President Reed from all decision-making authority pending county review. Bethany gasped. You can't do that. I am this board. No, Gary said gently. You were. Her clipboard slipped from her hands and hit the floor with a flat sound, one that echoed across the clubhouse like the final nail in a coffin. She turned toward me then, as if I were the cause of all her unraveling. Her eyes were wet, not from sadness, but from disbelief, from shock that her paper kingdom wasn't made of stone after all. You did this, she whispered. No, I replied quietly. You did. She fled the clubhouse before the meeting ended, her heels clacking wildly down the hallway, like someone running on cracking ice. The room let out a long breath. Neighbors came up to thank me, shake my hand, apologize for staying quiet so long. I nodded, grateful but tired. The fight wasn't over yet, but the hardest part was done. On the walk back home, the evening sun stretched across the lake, warming the air with a soft glow. The fence stood in the distance, its steel lines no longer threatening. It looked smaller somehow, weaker. A barrier built on false claims can't stand forever. Not when people finally see through it. Not when the truth weighs more than the walls built to hide it. In the days that followed the emergency meeting, the neighborhood felt different, lighter, as if someone had opened a window in a long-sealed room. Folks who once hurried past each other with tight smiles now lingered in driveways, swapping stories, sharing frustrations they'd kept locked inside. The fear that used to hover over every HOA notice slowly dissolved, replaced by a cautious, budding hope. And Bethany? She was nowhere. Her SUV vanished from its usual patrol routes. The HOA website listed her name with a quiet, temporarily suspended, as if avoiding the truth might soften the blow. But nothing could soften what had happened. Her authority hadn't been taken. It had collapsed under its own weight. You can't run a kingdom when the subjects realize the crown was paper all along. A week later, a for sale sign appeared in front of her large house at the far end of the development. Neighbors whispered about seeing her loading boxes late at night, stepping quickly, avoiding eye contact. Pride makes noise when it's rising, but it leaves quietly when it falls. I didn't rejoice. Not exactly. I wouldn't wish humiliation on anyone, even someone who had inflicted so much of it. But I did feel something settle inside me. A balance. A sense that the scales had finally leveled. The new HOA board wasted no time. A letter arrived in my mailbox on crisp white paper. The board acknowledges the validity of the pre-existing easement tied to Lot 14A. The HOA will refrain from obstructing access in any form. We appreciate your cooperation during this transition. It wasn't an apology, but it was enough. Sometimes justice comes not with an admission, but with acknowledgement, and the willingness to stop standing in the way. The fence remained in place for now. Removing something that large required planning, budgeting, approval. But now, whenever I looked at it, I didn't feel anger anymore, just perspective. It was no longer a barrier. It was a reminder, a marker of how thin the line is between power used properly and power used poorly. My access, however, didn't depend on any HOA vote. A few days after Bethany's house went on the market, I walked back to Lot 14A under a sky brushed with pastel evening colors. The pine needles rustled overhead, and the old wooden gate stood straight and proud in its fresh stain, catching the last light in warm amber tones. I pushed the gate open. The hinges swung silently, obedient, ready, confident. On the other side, the lake spread out beneath the horizon like a piece of living glass. Dragonflies skimmed the surface, their wings catching flashes of sunlight. The reeds whispered as the breeze moved through them. Everything felt restored, even if the fence was still standing. I opened the chain-link gate next, the lock yielding smoothly beneath the key that had changed everything. It clicked with the satisfying certainty of something that belonged exactly where it was supposed to be. Stepping through, I inhaled deeply. The lake air tasted clean, cool water, distant pine resin, the faint sweetness of meadow grass warming in the sun. I walked to the water's edge and felt the ground soften beneath my boots, the soil dark from recent rain. A small group of neighbors waved from up the trail. A couple of them approached, carrying fishing rods and folding chairs. People who once felt shut out now walked confidently, knowing the path was open again, not illegally, not defiantly, but rightfully. "Mind if we come through?" one asked. I smiled and held up the key. "This gate's meant to be used. Just respect it and keep it quiet. That's all I ask." Their smiles warmed me more than the sunlight. I spent the next hour showing them how to lift the latch properly, how to let the hinge fall without slamming, how to lock it from the inside so it wouldn't draw attention. It wasn't about secrecy, it was about stewardship. The easement was legally mine, but the lake belonged to everyone who loved it with the same quiet reverence I did. As dusk settled, the sky shifted to a soft copper haze. I sat on the small bank near the water and watched the surface glow like it had its own inner light, a light that no fence could diminish. I reached into my pocket and held the key between my fingers. It wasn't shiny. It wasn't ornate. It wasn't even new. But it held history in its grooves and the future in its promise. A simple piece of metal. And yet it had undone an empire of overreach. I whispered into the cooling air, words spoken for no one but myself and the lake. In the end, justice isn't loud. It's a well-kept path, and the right key. The wind carried the words across the water, smoothing them into ripples that spread outward, steady and unhurried, just like the truth. Sometimes standing your ground isn't about fighting harder. It's about knowing what's right and not letting anyone take it from you. If you've ever tangled with an HOA or fought for what's yours, drop a simple justice in the comments so we know we're not alone out here. And if you enjoy stories where truth and grit still mean something, feel free to stick around and subscribe. Plenty more lake, ranch, and land justice tales are on the way.